Welcome to 28storms.com on this Sunday evening, September 4th. This is a brief update on Tropical Storm Lee and Hurricane Katia. In the upper left-hand corner, you can still see that Tropical Storm Lee has a fairly well-defined low-level surface circulation between Louisiana and Mississippi, and along with it, we still have heavy rainfall across much of the southern states. However, there is a lot of dry air that has been wrapped into the low-level circulation, so this is becoming more of an isolated tornado threat, more so than the threat of flooding. However, we still run the risk of some isolated flash flooding across Mississippi and Alabama. HPC is still forecasting an upwards of about 5 to 7 inches of rainfall, which is fairly possible since the storm is still fairly slow moving. In the meantime, if we go ahead and switch back over toward the visible and evening infrared, we see that the hurricane out here in the central Atlantic has really gotten its act together over the last 24 hours. It now has maximum sustained winds of 105 miles per hour, and that makes it just below Category 3 status. Of course, it needs to be over 110 for it to be a major hurricane. And the upper level environment out ahead of it still looks to be fairly favorable for some further intensification, so this should become our next major hurricane of the season. As of the 7 p.m. advisory from the Hurricane Center, Lee is still holding on to its status as being a tropical storm. In fact, we still have tropical storm warnings from southeast Louisiana all the way into Destin, Florida. And notice that the storm is still not expected to move all that much over the next several days. By 1 p.m. Thursday, it's expected to be over central Tennessee as a remnant circulation, and that is in fair agreement with the latest model guidance. We see that all of the models steadily take this more toward the northeast. And as we switch over to Hurricane Katia, we see that maximum sustained winds are still, once again, 105 miles per hour. It's moving off toward the northwest at 12 miles per hour. And the 5-day cone of error does place the extreme eastern half of the Outer Banks of North Carolina under that risk. However, over the last 6 to 12 hours, we have seen the model shift back out to sea a little bit, so confidence is increasing that the storm will remain well to the east of the Carolinas. We still can't fully rule out some direct impacts along Cape Cod. However, the trend is positive this evening, and here is a look at some of that recent model guidance. And the tropical models do take this between Bermuda and the Carolinas, but with a gradual turn toward the northeast as another long wave trough begins to come in from the eastern United States. Here is the latest 3-day precipitation forecast from the HPC, and this is still somewhat of a concern here, the risk of flooding. What the deal is we have a front coming down from the northwest, and that's going to interact with our subtropical storm, and the interaction here could dump a lot of rainfall across the central and northern portions of Mississippi and Alabama, and then we have a little spike of around 10 to 11 inches here across some of the higher terrain of southwest North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. We also still have that tornado potential. We have 9 confirmed tornado reports so far across the country today. One of those are from upstate New York, actually, but the vast majority are related to Tropical Storm Lee, especially the most recent reports in the last few hours around Wiggins, Mississippi. And the latest Day 1 outlook, valid through 12Z tomorrow morning, is still indicating a slight risk of severe weather across the central Gulf Coast, and this risk is expected to continue into the afternoon hours tomorrow as we go into near Dothan, Alabama, Tallahassee, Florida, and southwest Georgia. If we look over some of the most recent 12Z dynamical model guidance, we see that starting with the CMC, it takes our Tropical Storm Lee over the Tennessee Valley where it pretty much just falls apart. Also notice that Hurricane Katia, or Katia, no matter how you pronounce it, is forecast to remain just to the east of the eastern seaboard, so this is a bit more of a rightward shift compared to what we've seen in the prior runs. And also notice this is a new development here within the last couple model cycles. The models are taking a front here associated with Lee into the southeast Gulf of Mexico, and as we go into days 4 through 6, we are beginning to see some of the models develop a second area of low pressure here over the southern Gulf. That could be the next feature to watch, and it's fairly close to home, so we will start taking a closer look at the southern Gulf of Mexico in the coming days. This is the most recent 18Z GFS sea level pressure and precipitation forecast. This is Tropical Storm Lee. This is Hurricane Katia. As we go into the first 48 to eventually the 72 hours as I advance this forward, we see that the stalled out portion of Lee is expected to make it into the Tennessee Valley and even into the Ohio Valley. But here's part of that stalled out frontal boundary that I was telling you about while observing the CMC. This is also being depicted fairly well here in the latest GFS run. And as we go into day 5, notice that the model, much like the CMC, is developing a weak area of low pressure here across the northern half of the Yucatan Peninsula, and that extends northeastward into southwest Florida. So that could be the next thing to watch. And as we go ahead and play this over again, you'll also notice that it's safely taking Hurricane Katia out to sea. And here is the run starting over again. There's a trough over the east, so that's going to deflect our storm away from the U.S. eastern seaboard. Here is a quick look at the 12Z European model run as we go into day 1, 2, and day 3. Notice that we started off with a trough over the southeast United States. This trough has lifted all the way into the Canadian Maritimes, and so notice that we still have a weakness in the 500 millibar pattern associated with Tropical Storm Lee over the southeast United States. But then as we go into day 4, notice that the troughing over the far northern Atlantic remains, and usually when you have troughing over the northern Atlantic like that, hurricanes over the western Atlantic have the tendency to recurve. So as long as that persists, then the U.S. hurricane threat should be fairly low, at least in terms of Hurricane Katia. And we also have the weakness here associated with Lee still in place as we go into day 4 and then day 5. But again, the troughing is digging here over the far northwest Atlantic, so eventually by day 6 the hurricane is making a turn more toward the northeast, and by this point the hurricane will be embedded in strong westerly flow coming out of the CONUS, so this is going to be steered more toward the east as we go into day 7. Also notice that the European isn't quite as thrilled over the prospects for another surface low formation over the northwest Caribbean or southeast Gulf of Mexico. So the model support isn't quite there just yet for possible development in that region, but it's just something that we'll keep an eye on as we go into tomorrow. So that wraps up your tropical weather update for this evening. Please check back tomorrow for another tropical weather video, and in the meantime, have a good Labor Day holiday.